Today I've got another lightning round video. You guys asked a lot of questions and I've got answers, so let's jump right in. First up, Glitch in the System wants to know, why are the main stories of a game called a campaign? The why of this question is pretty straightforward. In military terms, a campaign is a large-scale plan that involves a series of military operations. So it's a good word for a game with a bunch of missions that tie together to tell a story. The military term campaign originates from the plains of Campania in Italy. This region was notable as a site of annual wartime operations conducted by the armies of the Roman Republic. Over time, the name Campania became associated more with the concept of a season of military operations, and thus the word campaign came to denote a series of military actions. Of course, I wanted to know what game used it first. The first Halo in 2001 used campaign for its single-player mode, and I imagine this is probably where the word started getting popular, but it definitely wasn't the first. Now, I assumed it would be a military shooter of some sort, since that's where we often see the word used today. My initial assumption was it was going to be something like the first Medal of Honor game, which, if you remember, really started a whole decade of first-person shooter war games back in '99. But that game simply gives the option of New Game when starting a single-player game. It looked like Blizzard real-time strategy games might have given the trend its first push. StarCraft in 1998 uses single-player to start a new game, but refers to a campaign. A few years earlier, in 1995, Warcraft 2 uses the word campaign, and so did Warcraft 1 in 1994. I was pretty much ready to call it here. There's not a lot of RTS games before the first Warcraft. Dune 2 is usually considered the first real-time strategy game. It has a menu button labeled Play a Game, and when you choose a side, it refers to it as choosing a house. But then I came across F-22 Interceptor. It's a 1991 combat flight sim for the Sega Genesis. When you start a new game, it gives you the option of choosing between 4 different campaigns. So I thought, okay, surely this must be the first one. But then I got thinking about how, when you're playing pen and paper RPGs, players often refer to a long-running game as a campaign. So it would make sense if there is a D&D inspired game that uses that term. This brings us to 1978's Dungeon Campaign on the Apple II. A year later, it had a sequel, Wilderness Campaign. Now, it doesn't really have a campaign mode, since the game really just has one mode, but I'd still call this the earliest example of a video game campaign. Kanraku Cheese asks about the first explicitly female player character in a game. Now, today, female protagonists are pretty common. They haven't quite hit parity with their male colleagues, but we've come a long way from when a game like Street Fighter II would have a whole roster of male fighters and then one lone woman. Lara Croft from Tomb Raider in 1996 wasn't the first female protagonist by a long shot, but she was one of the first to really hit it big. 10 years earlier, we had Samus, who took us by surprise in Metroid, when we learned that she was the hero inside all that bulky power armor. Definitely an important character who remains popular today, still far from the first. Miss Pac-Man in 1982 is probably the first famous female protagonist in a video game.
Honey, don't you know, I'm more than Pac-Man with a bow.
But despite her song, Miss Pac-Man is essentially Pac-Man with a bow. More of a spin-off than a real character. In the Atari game Wabbit in 1982, a young girl named Billy Sue must defend her garden from hungry rabbits. She is the first female human character in a video game that is playable and has a name. But 1 year earlier in 1981, there was the arcade game Ladybug. While the advertising and artwork depicted a fairy-like woman with wings, the game clearly depicted a more traditional ladybug. It was an interesting game, clearly inspired by Pac-Man, but with the addition of these gates that the player could use to close off sections of the maze to slow down enemy bugs. This was the first female protagonist in a video game. Mega Magic Monkey asks when and where we got the concept of AAA games. So first up, what is a AAA game? I think most people have a vague idea that AAA means it comes from a big company or that a game had a big budget, but what exactly defines a AAA game? It turns out that that's basically the answer. There's no real rules, and the guidelines are always changing. The budget of what we consider to be an expensive game is always climbing. The term originally comes from the financial sector, specifically the credit industry's bond ratings. Investors rate bonds on a letter system where AAA bonds represent the safest investment opportunity and the most likely to meet their financial goals. At some point in the late 90s, game retailers started using a similar system when they were ordering physical games for their inventory. They wanted to predict which games were likely to have a greater demand. A AAA game was expected to be a big seller, and thus the store would order more copies of it. In the 2000s, the term made the jump to the wider game industry and started getting used in various gaming media. Today, it mostly just means that it was an expensive game made by a big company. Again, if you're wondering who was first, the first real AAA game is usually considered to be Final Fantasy VII. It cost $40 million to develop, which, at the time, made it one of the most expensive games ever created. It had a development team of about 150 people, at a time when development teams usually had closer to 20. This gave it one of the largest development teams of any game up to that point. There was also a massive marketing push that stood out for that time period. The funny thing is, most attempts to expand the phrase have failed. Various companies have tried to market their games as quadruple-A games. At some point, lower budget games have been referred to as AA games or B games, the way we had B movies. For a bit there was AAA Plus, which was supposed to be a AAA game that had some sort of live service that was giving it extra money, but none of these terms ever really seemed to stick. So now we kind of just have AAA games and everything else. I had a few questions about when bad guys started getting glowing or flashing weak points, specifically things like eyes and mouths. And whether it's eyes, mouths, or reactor cores, glowing weak points are another one of those things that's been around so long that it's kind of hard to imagine doing something like a boss fight without them. Let's start our journey by jumping back 20 years to E3 2006. A promotion for the game Genji Days of the Blade became famous when the promoter declared that it was based on real battles from Japanese history, then demonstrated a battle against a giant enemy crab boss.
So here's this giant enemy crab.
After he flips the crab on its back, he narrates,
and you attack its weak point for massive damage.
That phrase, attack its weak point for massive damage, and giant enemy crab became memes which I still occasionally see used today. The Zelda series didn't start the trend, but they've used this mechanic probably more than anyone. Most bosses from the series have some sort of weak point that usually must be targeted with a specific weapon or item. The trend of glowing weak spots really started with scrolling shooters. For example, the bosses of R-Type in 1987, which often had multiple weapons that could be destroyed with careful shots, and a final weak point to completely defeat them. Gradius and Section Z both came out in 1985. Gradius had enemies with glowing weak points that must be shot. Section Z had a final boss featuring a large flashing eye as its weak spot. Going back a few more years to 1982, we have Xevious. This game had a reoccurring enemy called the Andor Genesis Mothership. It serves as a boss with a destructible core and 4 flashing cannons that could be disabled with targeted shots. Phoenix is a little earlier, releasing in December of 1980. This shooter had a UFO boss with a visible alien pilot. The player had to chip their way through the UFO's armor and shields so that it could target the pilot directly. It's a little different from the flashing weak points we're used to today, but definitely an example of an enemy weak point. It should also be noted that the titular Phoenixes also kind of have a weak point. A shot to the body will defeat them, while a hit in the wing will eventually regenerate. Destroyer was released the same year as Phoenix. I had trouble getting an exact release date, but I think it's slightly earlier. It featured this big green alien head that could only be damaged by shooting a small target on its forehead, and I believe that this is the earliest example of a glowing weak point on a video game enemy. All this talk about attacking weak points got me thinking about the idea of headshots, a sort of very specific weak point.
Boom. Headshot.
And I was kind of curious what game did that first. Now, the first place I remember seeing them was in the Nintendo 64 game GoldenEye in 1997, which had a pretty advanced system of locational damage. But the first-person shooter with headshots was a little earlier with the sniper in the Team Fortress mod for Quake, which would eventually lead to Team Fortress Classic for Half-Life, and then after that, Team Fortress 2. But it looks like the very first headshot mechanic was even earlier in the 1994 rail shooter Virtua Cop. Most enemies only took one shot anyway, but enemies hit in the head would dramatically spin and flip backwards, making it different from a hit anywhere else, which I think kinda counts. Jesse Gartung wants to know who coined the term Metroidvania. So first, what is a Metroidvania? There's a bit of disagreement sometimes, but generally speaking, a Metroidvania is a genre of action-adventure game that emphasizes non-linear exploration. The world will have different obstacles that the player can't pass, so they must explore different routes until they unlock new abilities before backtracking to the previously impassable objects. Some purists will maintain that the game has to be a 2D platformer to be a Metroidvania. Personally, I don't feel like that's true. The word itself is a portmanteau of Metroid and Castlevania, two game series that are known for this type of gameplay. Now, the Metroid series has always had non-linear exploration and sprawling levels that open up new paths right from the first game. On the other hand, the first few Castlevania games are fairly linear and wouldn't really be considered Metroidvanias at all. It was only in 1997, with the release of Castlevania Symphony of the Night, that a Castlevania game became a Metroidvania game.
What is a man? A miserable little pile of secrets. But enough talk. How about you?
Now, I assume the term Metroidvania must have been invented around this time, but it actually looks like it was coined 4 years later, just a few months after the release of Castlevania Circle of the Moon. Scott Sharkey, a video game writer and editor who worked at OneUp.com, is sometimes credited as the creator of the word. But he's always been open about the fact that while he's likely responsible for its popularity, he didn't actually invent it. A man named Richard Hutnick is credited with coining the word in a post on Google Groups dated June 12, 2001. Although even Hutnick admits he might not actually be the first person to ever use the word, and he's just the earliest example that anybody can find. Over time, there's been some pushback on the term Metroidvania. There's the much less popular reverse term Castleroid. Some consider a Metroidvania and a Castleroid to be two different subgenres. The main difference usually being that if the game has character stats, experience points, and other RPG elements, it's a Castleroid, but it never really caught on. Some people don't like that it's a term made up of the titles of specific games, kind of like how we used to say Doom clone before the term first-person shooter became popular. But then to this day we still say roguelike, so who knows. In Japan, Metroidvanias are often called Tensaku Gata Action, or search action games. It's also been suggested they could be called unlocking world games, as sort of a contrast to an open world game. So what's the first Metroidvania game? Now, it would be reasonable to assume that it's just the first Metroid, released in 1986. But some people point to the 1984 computer game Below the Root. In this game, the player navigates a non-linear environment, finds items and abilities that allow them to open up and explore new areas. It's not quite what we usually think of when we hear the word Metroidvania, but it does manage to hit most of the key points. And that's where we're going to wrap it up today. If you've got your own little question or mystery that you want answered, let me know in the comments. Thanks again to everyone who asked questions that appeared in this video, and to all of you for watching. See you next time.